Hello everyone. Welcome back to the Symbiosis Literary Fest, and we're off to the first afternoon panel of the 17th December 2023. And for this round, we have a discussion, a fantastic discussion on the theme Critical Lens, investigating the impact of watchdog journalism. This will be a discussion that will explore the experiences in launching and running an innovative watchdog news and how such journalism supports democracy by strengthening journalism. We have with us Mr. Abhinandan Sekhri, who is the co-founder and CEO of News Laundry, who will be in conversation with Dr. Chindu Sreedharan. I will introduce Chindu first, and Chindu will take over from there and do Abhinandan's introduction. And we'll have a conversation for about an hour and a bit, and following that, time permitting, we'll go into the question and answer session. Now, Professor Sreedharan is a professor of journalism and innovation at Bournemouth University, where he works to understand evolving news practices and their potential to engender social change. He has a particular interest in reportage that extends the boundaries of conventional news work, and his research spans nonfiction and fiction, from the news reporting of post-disaster situations to news forms of digital narratives. Chindu has published a range of peer-reviewed research in leading academic outlets. His recent co-authored research publications include the impact of COVID-19 on journalism in Sierra Leone, disaster journalism, building news resilience in Nepal, and sexual violence and news media, issues, challenges, and guidelines for journalists in India. As a former journalist, he is also the author of two works of experimental fiction, Epic Retold, the autobiography of a villain. He also blogs at www.chindu.co.uk, that's CHINDU.co.uk, and can be found at the rate of Chindu at mastodon.social. Chindu, over to you.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Vasudev. It's always fascinating to hear about yourself from someone else's perspective. And most times when you're introduced on panels such as this, when someone is introducing you, you don't quite realize who they're speaking about. And then you go, oh, that's me. And you're kind of a little bit surprised and pleasantly surprised, I would say. I guess that's the beauty of journalism too. It helps us see things from a different perspective. And through the viewpoint of other people, the sources that particular journalists might have sought out for that story, we see truth, or rather we see versions of the truth, which often allows us to look at issues in a new light. And sometimes it challenges our assumptions and provides us a deeper, more nuanced understanding. I think that's the hallmark of good journalism in any case, actually, to move a reader or your audience from a position of understanding to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of that issue. So speaking about journalism, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the tagline, democracy dies in darkness, which the Washington Post adopted fairly recently, 2017. And for me, that has got a certain, even though it's a very US publication, it's got a certain universality about that. For me, it captures the essence of journalism in today's world. To repeat what might appear as a cliche, journalism is the light that illuminates the dark corners of power. It exposes the truth to public. It lays bare the things that powerful people want to stay hidden and not let the world know. So in that sense, journalism is the watchdog that keeps an eye on the powerful and holds them accountable. It's the voice that speaks truth to power. It's also the protector of truth. It's the protector of truth, and it protects truth from being silenced by power also. So it plays an incredibly essential and vital role in democracy. So the question is then, who holds journalism accountable? Who watches the watchdog? And how do we do it? How do we do it now? And how can we do it better? So those are the kind of questions that we want to explore today in this conversation with Abhinandan Sekhri. Abhinandan, um, I'm sure that you're familiar with the name and especially his his outlet. But let me give you a very quick introduction. Abhinandan is the co-founder and CEO of News Laundry. He also co-founded the TV, film, digital, and ideas house called Small Screen. Before founding News Laundry, Abhinandan worked as a producer, a director, and a writer in various television and film projects, including the award-winning food and travel show Highway on My Plate, and also new satire shows such as Gustafki Mav and Great Indian Tamasha. He was a reporter with India Today group from 1995 to 1999. And I'm really very excited and honored to have Abhinandan Sekhri with us today to share his insights and experience on watchdog journalism and media critique and democracy. Please join me in welcoming Abhinandan to this session. Abhinandan, good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, before we go into the question and answer, then the discussion bit of it, I want to say a little bit more about actually News Laundry, because a lot of our conversation is going to be revolving around News Laundry, which is a very interesting organization. It started out offering media critiques, but then over the years, it has evolved into something much more than that, much more exciting as well. So when you, across the world, when you look at organizations that provide a critique of journalism, media critique, you generally see them fall into a few different camps, a few different categories. Some of them work to protect media freedom, such as Reporters Without Borders and Committee to Protect Journalists, maybe even IFJ, which monitors and advocates for the safety and rights of journalists around the world. And in India, there are, of course, similar networks and associations that does the same similar function anyway, to support and empower quality journalism, such as the NWMI for women journalists, DigiPub, News for India Foundations, and several other organizations which work to strengthen the foundations of journalism. Now, the second category are what I would call regulatory outlets, such as the Independent Press Standards Organization, IPSO, in the UK, which is the regulator of most of the newspapers and magazines in the UK. Then we got Ofcom. In India, there is the Press Council of India, and so forth. But then there's a very interesting third category, which can be classified as meta-journalistic outlets, which publishes sometimes journalism about journalism itself, which publishes information on journalism itself, and have this meta discourses around how journalism is changing and so forth. So these range from fact-checking outlets such as factcheck.org and FAIR in the US, these are two US organization outlets actually, to journalism outlets again that produce media critiques in varying degrees, such as the Nieman Journalism Lab. It's kind of a part think tank as well as training associations like Pointer Institute, which provides training and resources for journalists and media organizations, all of it which is aimed at strengthening democracy, strengthening journalism. Now, News Laundry sits in this last category, at least in my way of thinking. It's an interesting and unique organization for multiple reasons. It's a reader-supported independent news media company. And this is the way that News Laundry presents itself. And I'm sure that Abhinandan can tell us a little more about this in a few minutes. It's in an industry driven by corporate and government interests. News Laundry strongly believe in the need for an independent news model and a free and accountable press. Through media critique, reportage, podcasts, documentaries, comics, and animation, our stories bring you the latest in current affairs in innovative and engaging format. Like I said, Abhinandan will tell us more about that in a minute. But one aspect of that stands out to me is the fact that News Laundry does not merely provide a critique of journalism, but also critical journalism, original journalism from a critical perspective, in other words. So in my view, journalism that's correctional and perhaps interventionist, in a way, News Laundry also provide the kind of journalism which I think they wish other news outlets provided in a way. So it's kind of curated corrective journalism as well it looks to provide. Maybe Abhinandan will differ, and I'm sure that we can have a great discussion around that as well. So anyway, I'm sure this will be a very interesting conversation. But before we begin, I just wanted to outline how things will go unfold. First, I'm hoping you will play ball with me here, Abhinandan. We're going to have a very quick fire round, and I'm going to ask you some very black and white questions. And I know this is these are complex issues that we want to delve in. So yes and no, or a single word answer is not going to be the most efficient way of doing that, and it might even be difficult. But this is just a way of getting into the conversation. So if you could answer yes or no to a few questions that I got, that I'd be grateful. Or you can take maybe a word or two, or absolutely necessary, go for it. Maybe take a couple of sentences, but quick fire round. And after that, once we've sketched out our major areas that we want to go into, we will try and unpack some of the topics and issues that we touched upon and go deeper into with more nuanced exploratory questions. And finally, I'm hoping that we'll have at least 30 minutes for Q&A, where the audience will have a chance to ask you, or for that matter, me, any questions that they might have or share their own thoughts. But for the audience, guys, please feel free as the discussion moves on, as we start speaking, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'm sure that Dr. Vasudev will be keeping a very close eye on that as well. Only one request I have actually for the audience. I would be grateful if you could ask explanatory or exploratory questions rather than just black and white questions. That prerogative, I am going to actually claim it for myself in this particular session. So do think a little bit about how you want to frame your questions so that you can get the best out of Abhinandan here. So without further ado, let's begin the discussion. Abhinandan, are you okay with the quick fire round?
Sure. Let's go.
All right, let's give it a go. Do you think the Indian media adequately reflects the diversity and plurality of the Indian society? Yes or no?
No, not even close.
Now, critiquing the media, does that not undermine public trust in journalism?
No, it enhances it actually.
Should the news media be regulated, or is it capable of self-regulating?
It already is regulated, yes, but what regulation means is different for different people.
Okay. Do you think Indian media houses embrace the opportunities of the digital era?
No.
Do journalists by and large make good business people?
No.
Interesting. We'll get into that a little bit further. Who do you think constrains media freedom more today, corporate houses or politicians?
Both have got, it's one continuum. It's become the same thing.
Okay. This is the last question. Is Indian journalism in peril more than it was before?
Yes and no. I mean, I'll explain. Yes, it is in peril, but the pushback also is harder than it has ever been before.
Okay, excellent. So we are going to we kind of sketched out those big broad topics that we want to get into, and hopefully we'll get into that in much more detail in a minute. But first, I wanted to start off this conversation with getting to know a little bit more about News Laundry, especially for those people who might not be extremely familiar with what the organization stands for. So I want to start off with a very simple question to start unpacking a little bit more about how it came to be, etc. I know that it started off in 2012 by you and two other journalists, with Madhu Trehan and Prashant Sureen. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about what was the context in which you began thinking about the organization, and what were you trying to achieve then?
Well, I used to work at Newstrack, which was a video news magazine back in the 90s. And journalism was very different back then. The amount of the internet didn't exist, as we know it. It was, all stories were researched over 3-4 days. scripted, shot over 3, 4 days. It was a, slow cook that, we then the final story that came out was anything from 5 minutes to, 25 minutes. It was really in depth. And then of course, Aaj Tak started while I was there as a half-an-hour bulletin where every story was, 1.5 to 3 minutes long. But by the late 2000s, and I had quit, and with my other co-founder, I had set up a production house, and we were doing video shows, non-fiction programming for Discovery. We were making ad films, etc., etc. But we had already seen the way news was not as insane as it is today, but it had become increasingly shrill. Stories are less about public interest, more about talking heads. And because I'm from the news ecosystem, I'm in Delhi, I'm connected, I know who's who. When we would watch TV, we could see how spokespersons of a particular lobby or a particular special interest group used to show up as, just objective commentators, which they weren't. We knew it, but there was no disclosures. At the same time, it was becoming frivolous. So Madhu, Prashant, Rupak, and I would often discuss this when we used to meet. And the idea was actually to start one show, a show critiquing the news, because in Indian media at that time, there was this unspoken code that media will not talk about media. In fact, there were many big stories about media houses that would never break. So no matter how much rivalry there was for market, there was this code that we will not. I mean, there was the exception of Indian Express and Hindu going at each other, but other than that, it was very rare. So that one show, no one wanted to put on their channel. Uh, so, and this is around 2010, 2011, we had started discussing with various people. That 2012, while the internet penetration wasn't that significant, it was just, I remember when we launched News Laundry, broadband was about 6% was the penetration in India. I think now it's closer to 50%, if not more. So we said, no one's going to put this show on. Let's just go online. And it was a passion project because small screen of production house already had video cameras, we had directors. So the one thing we were very clear about from the beginning, and that is something that we had identified back then, is that the reason news is going, I mean, it wasn't full of hate the way it is now, and it wasn't so hideous and so obviously vulgar in its propaganda. It was a little more subtle. But we knew how advertising interests were heavily influencing news, because we knew it from behind the scenes. So what we did was that we said our platform will be ad free, because the moment you start depending on ads, there's an inevitability that you will go down that road. So the one differentiator was at a time when it was unheard of in India that you'll have subscriber only, people will pay. Our payment gateway wasn't that robust, technology wasn't that great. We had just, built a very basic website. So the idea was to critique news because, like our slogan says, Sabki Dhulai. No one is above scrutiny. And the media at that time, like, sat on top of the pyramid. Like, you could discuss the judiciary, bureaucracy, Bollywood, business, bureaucrats, but no one could discuss the media. So the idea was that. So from one show, which would be anchored by Madhu, which was Clothesline, it became 2 shows, 3 shows, 5 shows, and then slowly. And we, of course, as soon as launched, it was such a new thing that, we got a lot of traction, a lot of people noticed us. And then we branched it into a separate company. And then we said, okay, now this is something that we're onto something, let's make it work. So yeah, that was the basic thinking. It wasn't supposed to be what it is, this full-on thing. It was just something that we'd started on the side as a passion project, something that we thought was important. So that's how it came about.
So you were not expecting it to become what it has become today?
I wasn't, I mean,
Happened?
actually, we hadn't thought it through that whether we were expecting. I remember I was asked to give a talk in late 2012 or early 2013. We were less than a year old. And I really had nothing to say at that talk. People were asking, what's your business model? It was just something we thought should be done. We did it. So I remember saying at that time, our business model is dekhi jayegi. We'll see. So, so it wasn't like we hadn't thought it will work. Of course, we thought it's important and it should work, but it was just something that we thought we should do. and then it just kind of evolved. So yeah.
Can I probe a little bit there further and ask you, okay, this was a passion project, and you obviously felt the need um, for having a robust media critic within India. But was there a so what was it that you wanted to achieve with that beyond that? Uh, beyond having a passion project, what is it that you wanted to change if there was something?
Well, two or three things specifically that we also wrote about earlier, that India did not have the concept of disclosures. Like there were anchors who were, related to, either married to, or in the families or children of, you know, pro prominent politicians, and they would be reporting on that, and the audience didn't know that, people would write columns. There's a very senior columnist, and I don't name them now. It's because this is a student's platform, but a full column would be written critiquing or endorsing a particular business project, and there'd be no disclosure that this columnist is actually a relative of that promoter of that. So, and when we used to see this now, out of everyone reading that, or 100 people, not even 1% people knew that there is this. So one was, there is no concept of disclosures. And we're proud to say, after we started pointing it out, disclosures started getting made. It became a thing. Earlier, it wasn't even a thing. In fact, even when business channels, anchors were talking about something, there were no disclosures. Do I have a position on this? Do I have a portfolio that has this share or not? These kind of things just didn't exist. The second thing was connections, disclosures about this show is sponsored by such and such brand, and it is endorsing that same brand. Now, those kind of disclosures didn't exist. What is, a paid content, and what is, news as it should be. So these are things that we wanted to actually inform the audience about, that this is not public interest news. This is just lobbying. This is marketing. So these two specific things we pointed out. And the idea was that, in a more general way, that it's not healthy to not critique each other. It doesn't mean you're enemies. It's unfortunate that we're in an age where, because of social media, things have got so polarized. I remember there used to be this ad in when I was young, an Olympics ad with these two guys wrestling, and a very moving voiceover in music saying, "You are my adversary, you are not my enemy. We play sport to build bridges." Uh, so, Politicians aren't our enemy. Other journalists, we have to be able to discuss and critique each other and criticize each other and appreciate each other without, becoming sadu about it or sulking about it. The fact that it's become at a stage where people don't even want to talk to each other, and politicians don't even want to give interviews, which are not scripted, is unfortunate. But the idea is to be able to discuss, critique, criticize, appreciate each other's work. We will make better things happen. And that just never used to happen in media. There was no, our show that started, The Cleaners, or the one that Madhu used to do, where journalists would sit around and discuss the important stories of the week, which one were well covered, which one were not. Um, that's a healthy practice.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I just want to actually go in there about the, when you look at the website itself, and in the way that your information is structured, it's again very different from a normal or a conventional or a legacy news site, for instance. And you have this series of very interesting shows, as you call them, because I guess you're coming from the broadcast side of things. So you got these serious sections of shows like Can You Take It, The Cleaners, you see, and The Clothes Line, and so forth. Could you, for people who are not that familiar, could you please talk us through some of these interesting ones, the major ones, and tell us what these are trying to achieve and what's the purpose behind those?
Clothesline is a stand-up, it's a basic satire format, like late night television in the US is, where you use humor, satire, to critique the work of news broadcasters, journalists, etc., while also shining a light on the compromises that they have made in reporting those stories, and in the ridiculousness of coverage. And it is so easy to get content on that. That was what Clothesline was. The Cleaners was, a bunch of stand-up comics, and that now stand-up comedies died in India because people are very scared of cracking political joke. But in the early 2011s and 12s and 13s, there was, stand-up comedy had come up in a big way, and a lot of stand-up acts were very political. So we had a few stand-up comics sitting around and discussing news and current affairs. Then there was a show that Madhu used to do called Can You Take It, which was basically conversations with journalists. And it was called Can You Take It because in our experience, journalists can't. They're happy to answer very aggressive questions, even sometimes impolite questions to everybody. But in the moment their question, they can't take it. So we called it "Can you take it?" to see can journalists take it, and some could, some couldn't. It was an interesting experience. Uh, then there was something called I forget the name, which Madhu used to do, which was a journalist, serious, very senior journalist, is trying to discuss the stories of the week. And then we had something called I Agree that I used to host, where I would interview people, sometimes people of extreme views and extremely, in my view, bigoted and often ridiculously toxic views. But I would never disagree with them, or even if I disagree with them, it would be in a way which is, a little. So the character I was, I would not disagree. It was called I Agree. So whether I was interviewing someone who had beaten up, a lawyer, or someone who had beaten up Valentine's Day couples, I'd always go into it saying that I agree. And the idea of that was that by not agreeing, you let them reveal their positions to such a ridiculous extent that they themselves are a little uncomfortable with their own position. Like if, for example, if someone said, such and such community, should not be allowed into, let's say, temples. And then I'd, go a step further and say, yeah, absolutely, they should be marked with a star and the houses should be marked and they should be, then the person would say, yeah, I don't know whether we should go that far. I said, no, why not? Let's let's push it. So that was the idea. But yeah, those are our video shows. We started a podcast, which was the editorial team sitting together discussing again the stories of the week. That became very popular as a podcast. We were amongst the first to start a podcast. And then the one thing that we did, which is very new, was tell political stories through comics. And I still think that is an extremely effective way of actually communicating ideas and political history to both young and old alike, because they're just very readable. You can pack in a lot of information, and you can also make them interesting through use of, you know, contemporary memes or contemporary humor or contemporary pop culture elements can be put in there. So yeah, those are, some of the things that we did.
What's your impression of the expanse of and the innovative ways that you're actually working with journalism? For instance, comic journalism. I think there's quite a few bunch of scholars actually looking at that academically as well. So you seem to have brought in a lot of those kind of very different inflections into journalism in an innovative way. And how has that actually been responded to by fellow journalists, number one, and the audiences? What is the kind of feedback that you get?
Well, amongst audiences, it's been great. We've got some fantastic feedback. In fact, there were some very respected journalists from overseas and around the world who series on Kashmir Story, which is a thick comic book, which is available actually on newslaundry.com. One can order it, and one on Naxal Bari to explain the entire Naxal movement. We got endorsements. People had read it, and they, at public forums, they said, we just discovered this at News Laundry. It's a fantastic way of telling the story, etc. Uh, from journalists, it was mixed. Like I said, journalists were not used to being critiqued. So in some cases, I was very surprised, and I've known some of these people for years, if not decades. It was a very churlish and childish response, which really I was taken aback by. In some cases, it was, fine, it's okay. But that was fewer cases, and the overwhelming majority of journalists just stopped talking to me and us, which I don't really care about, but yeah.
That's an interesting response, most certainly. Now, again, I think one other interesting aspect that stands out from amongst your work is the use of satire and humor. So these seem very important to you And I think again, it's coming back to your own traditions and what you used to do before, I think. But also, I wondered if, is that just personal preference, or is there a bigger strategy there? Is there a way of, are you thinking about that as in terms of audience engagement? Is there any kind of legal barriers that you're trying to make sure that that doesn't come down on you? What exactly is the thought there?
No, there's no legal reason. It's a combination of the first two things you mentioned. One is because that's my my background, my experience has been with writing satire and humor. And the second reason is that it kind of works well in telling the kind of stories that we want to. Humor is my default setting when I write. Even if I set out to write something serious, by the third or fourth paragraph, some joke will find its way. And I mean, I realize that's just, for 7 years, I wrote a satire show for NDTV, Gustaki Maaf. The show that I made, Highway on a Plate, was supposed to be a food and travel show, but we ended up making it a show about bad food jokes. So I think humor finds its way into anything that kind of I do. So that and the fact is that we were doing it well, so that worked. So that became like our identifier. But then our stories and reports, not everything is funny. But yes, our flagship shows are based on humor. Uh, and and because I do think it is a great way of talking truth to power, humor. It's a great way of actually unmasking hypocrisy. It's a great way of unmasking the vulnerabilities of the powerful. Um, it's a great way of, demonstrating that the emperor has no clothes on. So that's why.
So I think over the years, again, one of the things that you mentioned to me before in our conversation was how News Laundry has actually changed from being a purely media critique show. It has evolved over the years into also producing original journalism, the kind of journalism that probably is not being done elsewhere, or more should be done of. So I was wondering whether you could talk us through what brought about that change and how we went about that evolution. What was the reason behind that?
So, I mean, I will say that there are several journalists and a lot, especially digital outfits, are doing some fantastic journalism. There's the News Minute, there's Scroll. They have fantastic ground reports. In fact, they won a series of awards recently, both of them. Dhanya won Journalist of the Year, the Red Ink Award, which is, increasingly digital outfits with very small teams and limited resources are winning more awards than legacy media outfits with hundreds and thousands of employees and crores at their disposal. Um, but what happened was that oftentimes we weren't like doing fact check in the conventional sense, but the news narratives that were being constructed on television, we would often check what happens on the ground. So to confirm that is this what they said accurate, and we found a lot of cases they weren't. So we said, since we're in any case sending a reporter on the ground to check if that is accurate, we might as well start filing our own reports, an accurate report of this is how it played out. So earlier, those reports were about how something was reported. But then that is a very niche audience. So we said we should continue to do that. But if we expect people to pay, they must also get some value from actual reportage. It cannot just be critique that they pay for. While a lot of people are happy doing that because it was new, it was novel, people expected journalism and news outputs to be held to account. But it's not enough. Which is why we said in order to grow, stay relevant. And uh, what we were very clear about is that if you want to change the fundamental structure of news, not just a company, this may sound a bit of a overstatement, and it's not like a vanity project or anything, but we genuinely set out to change how news is funded. News in India is broken. It is broken because of a combination of regulatory frameworks, which I think may be a little technical for this audience, but I'm happy to get into it if you like. Um, and just how the revenue model is. Because India is one of those countries which is unique, where the government is a significant advertiser. State governments, the central government, every single ministry has hundreds of crores at their disposal, and they are giving ads to channels and news platforms. Now, there's a direct conflict of interest, which is huge. Newspapers, etc. I mean, you look at today's newspaper. The first 2 pages are full page ads that are government ads. So we wanted to, and in spite of this, broadcasters are doing so badly. They're often making losses. So our thing was that we have to demonstrate that this is not how news should be. And if we can make it work, that will be a default setting of how news companies should be. And the idea was to change the news economic structure, the financial structure. That's what we set out to do.
Yeah, I want to actually delve into that a little bit further, a little later, but that's great to hear you explain that. And a related point to this is also because when we look at your news site, for instance, it's probably one of the, I'm sure that all newspapers have got core values and a vision and a mission statement, etc., etc. But not many newspapers, news outlets actually spell it out the way that you've done that. You very clearly stated your position or of not having a position, your core values, etc., etc. For again, for those people who might not be familiar with all of that, would you be able to quickly summarize as what you stand for, what your purpose, your mission is, and also most critically, why you felt the need to spell it out so explicitly and how that helps in strengthening your news organization?
So on News Laundry, there's a post by me. It says our position on News Laundry, and in that, what we basically say is that individuals have positions. Organizations need not necessarily have positions on contemporary issues that are still being discussed and debated. Like for example, something that I never understood, and I thought was really strange when Times Group had started this thing called Times View, and they would take a position on anything from, it could be anything from IPL to SEZs, whether they're good or bad, whether Salvajudam is a good idea or not, or anything. And I was like, if you have a room full of smart people, all of them can't have this view. You know, Smart people have differing views. And also newspapers had that side edit, which is the newspaper's edit. It is not by a person. That is the position of the newspaper. Now, I can understand that if that position is that you should not murder people, or you should not, rape people, or you should not. Uh, so, and these are things that have been discussed and debated, but something that is still evolving. Was the stimulus post 2008 financial crisis, is it a good or a bad thing?
Hmm.
There is no fixed position on that. That's still being discussed. Was demonetization effective or not? So these side edits. So we said News Laundry has a position on things that are fundamental human values. You should not discriminate on the basis of religion, caste, color, gender, etc., sexuality. I mean, these are settled. I mean, I thought these were settled, although in 2023, from 2012, these are still being reopened. We are again upping, things that had been settled, that you should not discriminate on the basis of these things, have been taken up. But so that was one kind of independence, that everyone here speaks for him or herself. My view is not the organization's view. The organization's view will be clear, but that is not on contemporary things. The second thing is that we will not take ads either from corporations or from. And the third thing that we said, that objectivity is often misused, the word. It is often not really understood. Objectivity is a noble pursuit, and it is something that we should all try to attain, move towards, but it is impossible. Only math is objective, nothing else is objective. So let's aim for uh, facts, accuracy, context, because news is all about context. If you were to ask me what is news, news is context. Context is up there as number one. Everything else is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we spelled that out. That is our position on News Laundry. We will have, and the idea of Hafta, which is our podcast, which became very popular, was actually an exercise in transparency. It wasn't to give people news. It was that the leadership team, Madhu, Manisha, myself, and 3, 4 other people of our leadership team would sit together and discuss. And often we disagree with each other. So the idea was, let's reclaim disagreement. Disagreement doesn't mean you have to fight and shout at each other. You can disagree with your friends and your colleagues as well. So it was a demonstration, and it also revealed our biases. our prejudices, because we all have prejudices. I mean, a simple thing like, and I give this example all the time, a very close friend of mine, when I was young, his father was a very senior bureaucrat. And my father's an army officer, a retired army officer. And I remember when I was, for a while, my flirtations with activism. I was an RTI. I used to work on RTI. Uh, and there was a NGO called Parivartan, which later became PCRF, which later became the Jan Lokpal movement, etc., etc. So now this guy's a really smart guy. He's an honest guy. He's a good guy. And I know for a fact that even his father's an honest bureaucrat. But he was dead against the RTI. He said it just causes problems for the bureaucrats. And he had a problem with the kind of privileges given to defense personnel, the canteen, the hugely discounted and subsidized alcohol, etc. That the army has so much land, it has so much golf courses, they don't need all this. So no, my position is, I guess, because I'm the son of an army officer, I have a very critical take on bureaucrats. And I think they have way more power than they deserve and no accountability. Now, he wasn't a bad guy. He isn't a bad guy. But his position comes from his life experiences. So they're both colored by prejudices and our worldview and our life experiences. So I think, which is why objectivity is something that people claim, which I've got a podcast on it, objectivity. But accuracy, context, and facts are sacrosanct.
Absolutely. I think I couldn't agree with you more. There's a huge debate and tons of papers written around the myth of objectivity and how that's an ideal that we should all strive for, but it's never really achievable, and maybe a more reasonable goal to aim for is something that we could call informed subjectivity to some extent, because you're investigating something, you're inquiring into something, and then you are formulating a standpoint based on the nuances and the context. As you say, context is absolutely critical too. So couldn't agree with you more. And I'm sure that some of the students and the audience would have more interesting comments to make around that. There's one last little thing that I wanted to pick up on news laundry, because I think it's got so much of importance that's not quite recognized. For instance, one of the things that stood out for me on your website is that the way that you treat the transparency about gender and about and you got this little statement there actually, which says, at News Laundry we believe in the importance of transparency for diverse and representative organization, and here is a breakup of our caste, gender, faith, and sexuality across the team. So that's again very unusual to see that kind of transparency. Could you tell us why that's important for a news organization?
So I've said this at other places also. I had heard this in a talk, I forget where, that the one thing that reduced accidents the most when the automobile became a commercial product to be rolled out was actually not the seat belt or a better brake. It was actually a speedometer, because people didn't know how fast they were going until the speedometer was there. So you have to first make the invisible visible. Only then can you correct it. So we keep talking about representative newsrooms, more representation on the edit page, etc. But there was no place where we could actually see that what is the breakup, how representative are newsrooms, how representative are the op-ed pages. So we said, let's go about and start doing this. So we spoke with a few organizations who backed us. The UN Women India backed us, Oxfam backed us. In the beginning, even Facebook backed us. I said, okay, we'll do this. Of course, you have to start even the ownership pattern. If you see that when News Laundry started, the first thing we put was our ownership pattern. Who owns how much of News Laundry, the equity breakup. So the one thing until today, I mean, we've put out the report, I think 4 or 5 years running. It's very difficult. Newsrooms don't want to tell you their caste breakup. They don't want to tell you their gender breakup. They don't want to tell you what we can get, which is absolutely, it's simpler to do is we take the op-ed pages and the front page and how many bylines are by, men, how many bylines are by women. Now in op-ed pages, and we found that, if there is a rape or if there's a women's bill, suddenly they'll, out of the 8 editorials that are there, you'll have maybe 6 by women and 2 by men. But when there's a financial crisis, there'll be all 8 will be men. So we did a study. We had a huge team of about 20, 25 people who went through hundreds and thousands of papers, newspapers, panels, you know, um, uh, how often do men appear on panels, how often do women appear, on what issues do women appear, and on caste. And it is dismal. I mean, Indian newsrooms are not dominated, they are almost completely inhabited by privileged caste Indian men. And that was a revelation. Even now, when we ask for, and we have young people who come and do this, the rudeness that they have to deal with when we call up senior journalists to ask for the breakup of their newsrooms is, I'm aghast that how absolutely ill-mannered and ill-informed and completely oblivious to the importance of this very senior journalists and editors in our country are. They just don't want to reveal what their breakup is. And I think everybody should. And I mean, I will say that we are a lot better than we were when we started, because there are many problems associated with it, because certain communities have been marginalized to such an extent. It's very difficult to get mid-level management and top-level management from there. You can get young reporters. And even today, I don't think our newsroom is adequately representative in senior positions by marginalized communities. And of course, and I personally have I mean, I'm not, I guess also because I'm going to be 50 next year, I did not really care whether we had the sexuality also in that, because in my view, it's impolite to ask. But at the same time, I understand, because I have, youngsters who work with me. They say, no, it's important because there is a inadequate LGBTQ representation, so we should have that as well. And I'm like, but is it polite to ask someone in a form that, are you heterosexual, you're bisexual, you're gay? They say, well, it's as impolite to ask, any other questions. So, but I said, okay, let's put it there, because I mean, I understand that representation has to be there, but I think that's going to be the most difficult one to pull off, because how many people will actually be okay with you asking and putting that there? But we have a form when anyone joins, you just only fill that. Whatever you want to fill, fill. If you don't want to fill, you don't. But generally, because the culture at our is that if we want transparency from others, we have to provide transparency ourselves. So that's the whole idea. And so we brought out that report. That report has been quoted by many, legacy media houses. It's been quoted internationally, but it is always a huge challenge raising the funds to put that together and getting newsrooms to actually reveal their diversity breakup to you.
Yeah, interesting. Do you also think that the diversity, the way that your newsroom is structured, the kind of reporters that you have and their own representative diversity, do you think that also affects the kind of news that you might be putting out, the kind of journalism
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. I mean, uh, I've realized that, with time, I mean, the newsroom that I used to work in, where I learned in, there were certain things that, weren't considered improper or inappropriate. It's, when you have others, you have people who educate you on that stuff, and then you learn. I think I mean, basically, if understanding the importance of diversity is understanding democracy, why can't we have 10 really smart people who go through a process of interviews and give them the country to run? Why do you have to have voting and this representative democracy? Because I don't understand the problems of someone that, like, for example, no matter how much I may say that I understand what it's like being a woman, I don't. I remember Madhu, told me, she says, you should not use that word, I know what it's like, because you don't. From the time that you get into a car, the gaze of the watchman, the way this guy, from how people look at you to how people talk to you to how people try to touch you, you're going through life with your fists up. You can't understand that. You may understand for 5 minutes, but think of going through the full day like that. So I get it. People. I remember when I was shooting Highway when I played, and I was in the Northeast. We had driven from Kolkata to Santiniketan, then to Guwahati, Shillong. We had gone all the way to Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, etc. And some of the things that I learned when I was there of what is best for them. One assumes that the planning commission here can decide that, the best use of resources for a village in Hembang or in Arunachal is, I don't know, a drain or this. No, for them, they said, we need a hall, an entertainment hall. I was like, why? They said, because every year we lose dozens of kids in our villages who have to go all the way to the nearest town, Tawang or something, to watch a film or for a rock concert or anything, for a wedding. If we just had these in our villages, and the roads there are full of mist and Meghalayas because there are clouds everywhere. So people who live that life can give you the best understanding of the problems and possible solutions. You can't, no matter how much you read. Lived experience is important. And because lived experience is the most important aspect of understanding things, you have to have people of diverse lived experiences telling you that. That is why democracy is the best form of governance, and that is why representative newsrooms will be better than newsrooms that don't have adequate representation.
Thank you for that answer. Now, before I would like to explore a little bit about the state of the Indian news media and the freedom of the press and the freedom of the media, etc. But before we do that, I want to share a little screen to the audience so that I want to actually get an idea of how you guys are actually thinking about that. So I've got one little question, and Vasudev is going to send out a link in the chat. If you could just take 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute, to pick out, this is what you need to do. Basically, you should be able to see this on your screen once you click through to that link. Vasudev, if you could just say yes.
Yeah, I've shared the link. Just a quick heads up. So the audience will not, quick heads up to the audience. You will not be able to write back on your chat. It's a clickable link. So if you can click on that, it'll take you to the page.
Yeah. So basically, what we would like you to do at this point, everyone listening, if you could just describe your thoughts on journalism in India in just 3 words. Pick 3 words that you would use to tag journalism. Yeah. And if you could just fill that in, it will start populating the screen, and then we can have an idea of how you guys are viewing. Biased, mess, yes. Chaotic. Keep them coming, please. Okay, that might take a little bit of time. So what we'll do is inadequate. While that happens, what I think I'll just switch off the screen and I'll come back to the screen in a minute. But let's keep the conversation rolling. I think I've got some more questions which I would like to get Abhinandan's view on. So please keep writing, guys. So Abhinandan, let's keep talking. Actually, looking back over the years at your time in journalism from 1995 onwards, you've seen a lot many decades and many political eras, I would say. So what are the major threats to journalism today? The reason why I'm asking this question is that the perception is that it's mainly political, but I'm guessing that there is a much more complex picture than merely political. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, I can't give you a very short answer to this, but I'll try.
No, long one is good.
It's a little more complicated because you see, the interests of news organizations pre-liberalization were different from what they are post-liberalization. Once large industrialists understood the power of news, their entry has made it even more complicated. And ever since social media came about and politicians and political parties have understood and realized the power of social media and building news narratives, it has become even more complicated. So there's this big mess of political interference, corporate interference, and most importantly, in a country like India, which in any case, the media was never very outspoken. I think culturally, India and Indians across, ages are extremely hierarchical in nature. We tend to have an unhealthy, reverence towards power. I think that's a hangover of the caste system. Freedom of speech is not a value that every Indian will fight for. I think for most Indians, they'd say, "So what? If you're being asked to shut up, it's okay. You should shut up." It's not something that culturally we hold dear. So because of a variety of these things, Indian news media was never as independent as it should be in a healthy democracy. Having said that, it has never been so deferential and so obedient as it is today. And it has never been under such a threat as it has been today, because a combination of various regulatory changes, whether it is on FDI, whether it is on compliance, on a mechanism of complaints, whether it is the new broadcast, the new bill that is being proposed for digital media, whether it is the earlier amendments to the IT Act that have been stayed, at least one part has been stayed by the Kerala High Court. So combination of this regulation and the use of state agencies, FIRs against journalists, charges of terrorism against journalists. This has made journalism extremely high risk. It was always slightly high risk and low returns, but now it is extremely high risk. And unless you comply with with power, it is low returns. But if you comply, then it's high returns. So the incentive structure, the risk and reward structure of news is completely broken in India, which is why it's a complete mess. And regulation has a lot to do with it. Corporate interests have a lot to do with it, because think about it. Why would someone who's in oil and gas, energy, mining. I mean, these are industries that have revenues in thousands of crores, have valuations in tens of thousands of crores. The market cap of some of them going to a lakh crore. Why would they want to invest in in an industry that is worth 400-500 crore? It's like if I own a big mall, would I want to own the pawn shop outside? Unless that pawn shop does something very important to keep my mall alive. Uh, so, I mean, business-wise, it makes no sense for people in energy, telecom, oil, mining to be getting into news. There is no financial incentive. So then why are they doing it? Obviously, there's some other incentive. So, which is why I say news, the entire structure in India is completely broken. It is not, news is basically something that makes the public more aware. It's called the fourth pillar of democracy because the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, take decisions that impact our lives. But in a democracy, how do those three pillars come about? We pick people to bring those about. Now, if we ourselves are uninformed, we'll make poor choices. So I would say media is the most important pillar of democracy because it is the pipeline that is actually feeding information for the citizens to make decisions and choices that will determine the health of the other three pillars. If your information pipeline is polluted, what's going to happen to the other three pillars? So yeah, in India, it's completely messed up. It is in a lot of other countries as well. This Berlusconi, that Italian prime minister, his entire media empire, how it served him. Um, the entire cultural project that was basically the reason for Fox to be set up. It happens in most countries, but the checks and balances are there. So while there is a tilt towards one side, there is a corrective mechanism, whether it's through regulation or whether it is through culturally, the freedom of speech is too important, so they will not allow anyone to be shut down. But here, journalists can be jailed for terrorism charges. FIRs can be filed for filing a true, accurate story. Um, but you will not see outrage. It's fine. We just don't hold that as an important value worth protecting.
I think there are a couple of things that I wanted to pick up. One of the things that you touched upon is the whole idea of media ownership and how that pattern has changed for the worse. Interestingly, I was reading a paper in by Saima Saeed, who is at Jamia Millia actually in journalism studies. It's one of the journal papers which only academics read, I guess. So it was a critique of how the media ownership patterns have changed for the worse, and I'm sure that you would be interested in my little bit of quote from that, and here and how because of that there's a huge decline in the quality of journalism, basically. So, and she writes, corrupt funding procedures and concealed ownership patterns have orchestrated a crisis of credibility for journalism while posing fresh challenges for media governance and the nature of democracy. So she's done a very strong study around some of the media ownership patterns, and some of the major uh, journalism outputs that have come out in recent years and have come to that conclusion. And as a practitioner, I was wondered if I could have your thoughts on this as an insider as well as a media critic. How do you think that these kind of media ownership issues that you just highlighted, as well as what Saima is highlighting, how is that felt within newsrooms? What are the pressures that ordinary grassroots level reporters and editors face because of these in their
So
day-to-day practice?
I'll just tell you a very clear outcome has been, and I can tell you because I know a lot of these people. Most people interested in journalism are quitting these newsrooms and often leaving the industry. They are getting into, PR, or they get into corporate communication. They said if we have to, do that, we might as well do that honestly as a living, rather than pretend to do journalism and do PR. Um, the amount of highly qualified, accomplished, and excellent journalists who are out of jobs is amazing, is just mind-blowing right now. And the amount of people who have no understanding of or interest in journalism, who have primetime shows and who are actually in important position in news organization, is mind-numbing. I mean, it is, and I had gone to give a lecture at a business school in Ahmedabad, and I said, you guys are the smartest. One of you should do a paper on, market failure. And there are many examples of market failure the world over. One very interesting one to study is India, where competition has not increased either the quality of the product or a better product for the consumer or better allocation of resources. It has actually just destroyed a product like news. But that's just how it is.
So I think the second point that you mentioned, apart from the media ownership part of, was also I actually, yeah, before I go in there actually. So yes, there is a major big problem which is making journalism much more precarious than it ever was. So what is there an easy solution out of here? What do we need to do? What needs to change to make journalism more strong?
I think too many things need to change. It's I think difficult and unfair to put the overwhelming burden of that on news consumers, because uh, the general average citizen in India is very disempowered. As citizens, we don't have the power that citizens of other liberal democracies do. Um, but I would think the biggest thing that needs to change is we need uh, an establishment, people in power, whether it's judiciary, whether it's in politics, whether it's in industry. We need people of slightly better caliber and courage. You hear these statements all the time. You see some management guru or some industry leader who will be sitting on panels at these industry outfits saying that the key to entrepreneurship is boldness. You have to be bold. You have to have the courage to take decisions. But in all honesty, I'll tell you, they are the most cowardly lot, because to protect their interests, they're willing to throw any value under the bus. So while I think there is an onus on the public to pay for news and not leave it to industrialists, I mean, it's okay to just whine about it all the time, but you got to go out there and support news yourself with, $100, $300, or whatever it is. But the overwhelming, I would say, is in any society, and there's a very interesting lecture by Professor Jared Diamond, who's an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, where he talks about why societies collapse. And he studied that from, the Norse society to, Rwanda, just across centuries. And the one finding that he finds that's common in all these societies that he studied across the globe is when the elite, the people who are the most privileged and powerful in society, when they abandon values, is when societies decay the fastest. So I would always put the onus on those who have the most power, whether it's in public service, whether it's in industry, whether it's in the judiciary. If you do not demonstrate courage, it is unfair to expect the man in the street to display courage.
I think the other point that you touched upon was also the media policy issues, and I know from our conversation that that's something that you think is extremely critical for a strong and vibrant democracy, really. And I wondered, why is that so? And where are we with it? Are we paying enough attention? Should we do more?
So I think, when they say should media be regulated, I always find that a trick question, because if I say yes, the assumption is that I will endorse the regulatory framework through the bills that the government is proposing. The fact is, the media is already regulated. It's not like we're unregulated. Libel laws apply to us. I myself am fighting 4 cases in court. I've won one of them. Um, there are regulations in place. What is the additional regulation that the government wants? Whether it is how funding is, whether it is what is the onus on news platforms to take down stuff, on what basis, on ad hoc, takedown notices by the government where they don't have to explain what is wrong or what is not. So I think if all political parties, if they say we value democracy, democracy is very important to us, but their regulatory frameworks are weakening and making news more controlled more by them, I think that is the most clear sign that they actually don't value democracy. Given half the chance, they would want to remove the democratic process altogether. Because if you value democracy, you will value news. Because there is no democracy without news. And there is no news without democracy. In fact, DigiPub, the organization you mentioned, which is a collective of digital news organizations, we are having an event on the 20th, I think, yes, on the 20th, if I'm not wrong. And that those videos will be put online. The students can watch it to get an understanding of what are the kind of regulatory frameworks being proposed, and what we'll be critiquing those and having discussions around those.
And I wondered if there is a role that journalism education, as in journalism educators like ourselves, as well as journalism students, can play in understanding this regulation so that they grow into people who are much more active or proactive against regulations that might be dampening democracy.
I think whether it is the bill that has been proposed, just to read those, there are several pieces that are written around this, and also this DigiPub event, the full day event that is going to happen. If they just watch those sessions, they'll get to learn a lot, because it's very difficult, because there are the regulations, everything from content to FDI to, in broadcast case, licensing. There are too many moving parts to really into one, but it is something that significantly impacts how journalism works.
Yeah, and it's not just one. It's not just the what is it? The information technology, digital bill. It's a combination of all of these things interacting together that actually constrains journalism more than ever. Okay, excellent. So I'm sure that that would be something that students would be keen to do. And I think, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you one last question, and I think this is something that you can help. It would be very helpful for any new journalism entrepreneurs who might be waiting in the wings. So one of the things that I find from our conversation, but also looking at journalism in general, not just in India but across the world, really is that a critical factor that kind of threatens and constrains the ability of journalists to work is actually money, really, financial viability, because I think the digital disruption has brought with it its own challenges, in the sense that there are too many pop-up news outlets happening, and so much news noise that's happening, that to be viable and be sustainable and have a revenue model that actually works has become much more difficult in that sense, because there's way too much competition and noise. So while there are plenty of opportunities, it's a rather bleak landscape out there financially, especially in India, I would say. Actually, no, everywhere, I would say. And to make money and to survive well is not easy. And as someone who seems to have done that in a very competitive market, I've wondered if we could have a little bit of your thoughts about what's needed in journalism, what's needed in a journalism entrepreneur to be successful. What do you need to transition from being a good journalist into the business of journalism? And specifically, are there aspects of the profession that might be holding back journalists from becoming good business people?
Well, I think generally journalists tend to be very well informed by and large. And journalists, I use the word what I understand of journalists, not the prime time anchors who are fairly clueless. Um, Now, because they're pretty well informed and they are pretty smart, uh, one thing that I find is that they have a slight, and I think this is a historical, I mean, I don't know why it is, maybe the industry encouraged it at some point. There's a certain disdain and disrespect for, management types. And to make systems work, you have to create systems that are, management heavy systems. And I think journalists, at least very senior journalists of the old mold, tend to be a little dismissive and uh, still contemptuous of business management. And for that reason, they, at least the ones who become entrepreneurs, I think they tend to find it hard to balance keeping control and also relinquishing control. While you can keep control of content, there has to be some sort of an understanding of viability is key. So I think that is one of the reasons that journalists, I mean, I always tell people who ask me that, do stuff with a co-founder or two. Have 2 or 3 co-founders and each of you have a different skill set and are equal. So you can push back on each other. Otherwise, it won't work. You can't just say that I will keep posting self-indulgent stories that I'm only talking to myself and my peers about. There has to be some sort of understanding of what is working why. But I think the most important thing is that it's not that everybody, in journalism or all these owners and editors were compromised or, bad people back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They also meant well. Some of them are fantastic professionals. But at that time, there was no internet. So there was only a one-way communication mechanism, whether it was broadcast or whether it was print. I will put out information and you will consume it. Internet changed that. People could get back to you immediately, real time. So in my view, if you really want to crack the journalism revenue model or the structure or the financial structure, you have to see it's not just taking what was already print and putting it online. You have to say now we have a two-way mechanism as opposed to one way. You can weed out the distributor sales. You have to use the tool. It is like when the printing press came about, I need not have written 10 copies and sold them. I could print them. You got to use this very powerful device. And I think if you want to make journalism work sustainably, one has to look at it not as just, information. One has to look at it in the full context. What is the ecosystem we're working in? What are the tools and devices and weapons at my disposal? Now, how can I use each of these to tell the story? I think just stepping back and looking at it as an industry rather than looking at it as just a story is the differentiator.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share the screen with you again once more so that you can see what the word cloud looks at. But also that concludes our question and answers session. So you can see the way that it's been described: biased, corrupt, inadequate, lots of negative words there, groveling, appeasing, cowardly, confusing, corporate, nuanceless. I like that. Chaotic, not genuine, propaganda peddler. Yeah, you pretty much covered the whole spectrum, I think. But I think we can now take some questions. Vasudev, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, that should be fine. As Chindu had previously mentioned, if the audience who are with us on Zoom right now, if you have any questions, it'd be great if you could type it into the chat box. We have a couple that the students have sent in to us, and I was wondering if I could read them
Please.
out to you. There's one from Miss Shalini Tripathi, and I think she's from a student from the Symbiosis Institute of Digital and Telecom Management, and she asks something that's relevant to the screen that you just shared a second ago. To what extent does the presence of watchdog journalism shape public perception of truth and trust in the media?
It's very hard to quantify. I choose to think that it has an impact. Of that, I'm absolutely certain, because we have seen, at least early days, certain changes, like disclosures suddenly popped up in newspapers and television. And there is some sort of media literacy also. There's a contagion of courage. But how big or huge is the impact? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's enough. But then again, I only consume Hindi and English news media. And I would like to put this rider to everything that I've said. It is only contextual to Hindi and English media, because in India, if you go to Kerala, for example, the overwhelming majority of people are consuming Malayalam media, Malayalam news. Same thing in Tamil Nadu, same thing in Marathi news. So, having said that, English and Hindi media does have the most dramatic impact, even though the audience may be lesser than the rest put together. But I think it's making an impact, but I think way more needs to be done.
Right.
If I can jump in there with a little
Yeah,
bit,
please.
again, I'm not quite clear what watchdog journalism is within the parameters of that question, whether it's actually watching the watchdogs, or as in watchdog in the traditional manner of speaking. If it's the first, if the second one, I think I think there's quite a few studies across the world. Actually, there was one study in Latin America, actually across different countries, which shows that and of course in the UK and in the Western world as well, that trust in media has eroded, is eroding actually. But people do believe that this whole fourth estate idea, that's still something that most people are invested in, and that's something that people want the media to do. To how effectively we do that is where the question of trust actually comes, and we're actually losing out on trust, because the public perception by and large is that the media is not doing its job well enough. So and of course Abhinandan has actually outlined some of the factors that contribute to that. But there is absolutely, like you said, there's no democracy without news.
Thank you, Shalini. I hope that answers your question. I have a question from a student called Pratham Maru, and I'm going to hope to add on to his question because I have a few questions of my own. He asks, are there any insights into the impact of watchdog journalism on corporate accountability and responsibility? And to that, I was going to add, um, with watchdog journalism, the idea is to stand up and hold the powers to be powers that be accountable. And Abhinandan has laid down how often the response from the power structures are such that it puts your profession into a sort of a high risk group. I'm just wondering, have there been any sort of positive or transformative responses at all? In instance, have somebody reached out to you and said, "Boss, okay, yeah, you're right. We're going to make such and such amendments." We don't get to hear these things quite often. Have you had instances?
So, other than the fact that you get threats of legal, notices, etc., come, very few of them actually take it all the way to court, because they really don't have a leg to stand on. In one particular case, I will not name the channel or the brand, but one where we saw the impact was black and white. We were clear; it wasn't vague. There's a prominent French brand that sponsored the primetime show of a very hateful anchor. And we had this series that we used to run called Bloodlust TV, where we would take chunks that this show was sponsored by such and such brands. Now, there have been cases in the US where a bunch of brands have withdrawn from something like Breitbart or Fox for anti-Semitism or from very hateful and bigoted views. The same brands in India have no shame, because as a society, we don't hold them to account. So in that particular case, and there is an organization in Europe called, I think, Sleeping Giants and Bellingcat, Bellingcat and Sleeping Giant. They advocate, against hate news and brands not to get associated. So they kind of picked up our article and pushed it there. And we know at least one case where the head office of that French brand withdrew, I guess, from instructions to the Indian office. That brand withdrew the advertising from that particular. But the thing is that what are you going to do when the government of India is advertising there? You see, if you have a Yogi ad or a Modi ad, so that kind of, you, what are you going to do about that? You see, I think one thing in the social media age we've realized is embarrassing someone has become harder. Shame has become harder. People are proud to wear their bigotry on their sleeve, whether it is Trump, whether it is the misogyny that you see in Indian cinema. There was a slight self-consciousness to that. People would be get defensive. They may not alter their behavior, but there was a jisko hum muh ki sharam kehte hain. Even that's gone now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I come from a state where you traditionally used to have two separate media sort of thrusts, which come from the two parties that hold sway in that state. So, if I may ask a question to Professor Sreedharan, actually, to push you up on, the paper from the Latin American study. There was one done by Claudio Meledo, which sort of compared Watchdog journalism across the 5 Latin American countries, and she had this to say, and I was wondering what your thoughts are. And Abhinandan, please feel free to chip in. That she says that it's almost impossible for right-leaning or moderate-leaning media to act as watchdog journalists. Does that automatically put the iterations of watchdog journalism that we have today into the left of the political spectrum? If one does that, what are the implications of that kind of a reading, or what do you think of that kind of?
I'm not sure about the left part of it. I think it's very difficult. I think depending on the context in which your media is functioning, it's very difficult. It can be difficult, or it can be more, less difficult in how you do your job, really. And most of the time when we speak about media constraints, we speak about political constraints. But I think, in that excellent interview that you did, Abhinandan, with Vinod Mehta a long time ago, I think he makes a very interesting point, doesn't he? He actually says that it's very easy to call out political forces and take a pot shot at politicians, but it's much more difficult to take a pot shot at corporate houses. Now, when you're in most nascent democracies, or in most places where the media ecosystem is much more nascent than it's in India, then it becomes even more difficult for journalists to play the role that they should work with. For instance, I work a lot with journalists in Sierra Leone, actually, some of the organizations there to actually strengthen journalism there. So, and for that matter, Nepal as well. And a lot of those journalists, actually, now we feel in India and in the UK also, we feel that we are kind of being constrained and hemmed in by powers, and there's all sorts of pressures on us. Yes, there are political pressures on us, but the extent of other pressures that limit our journalism is much less. We don't feel we have the luxury, a comparative luxury in some senses there. So when there are financial pressures, when the stages of journalism, when your evolution in the journalism ecosystem is at a lower level, then you feel a lot more of the pressures than in let's say in the Western countries, and you can't have the luxury of doing good journalism always. So I think in the Latin American model, in that particular study, it's very hard for journalists to do their job if they're not getting paid, and that is quite typical of economies which are developing, or which are at a different stage of development than ours. So the media houses are less powerful. And if you're less powerful, then of course you can't withstand the power of the power structures.
Yeah, coming to I mean, rather than describe it left and right, I prefer the usage of progressive and conservative, because that is a much larger kind of uh, grouping of ideologies. Because conservatives need not necessarily be left, but I get what you're saying, that the push tends to come from the more progressive side, because that is in its very nature, the progressive side tends to push for change, and the conservatism, by its definition, tries to hold on to certain values that they think are important. Like, for example, I mean, let's I mean, I won't take Indian examples because that can be polarizing, and your students can have different uh, political choices. But let's take America, where we don't have a dog in the fight. We don't have a preference. It doesn't really bother us that much. uh, Trump's slogan was "Let's make America great again." Now, a late night show actually went ahead in Trump rallies and said, okay, when was it great? Was it great during slavery? Was it great during Jim Crow? Was it great during segregation? It wasn't "let's make America great in the future." It's again, that there was a time of greatness. Was the time of greatness where blacks were, even in worse conditions than they are today. So conservatism tends to cling on to structures how they are or how they should be. That's what they believe. Progressive mindsets want to change them. They're not always for the better. They may be too radical, that changes that happen too quickly can actually destroy societies. So that is the battle. So I think generally the tendency of pushing back at power is a progression. I can tell you from my experience in Indian journalism, many of these people who are like prostrating themselves and to the present power structures, they would sit with me in my studio and did not have the guts to say anything about the early government. That also I was only doing. You see, because we were more critical of the past government as we are of this. And the guys today who keep abusing the past government, when the past government was in power, they have sat in my studio and have not had the guts to criticize it. So the onus on change will always be on the progressives. And the onus to defend existing systems and status quo will always be with the conservatives.
Superb. Thank you. Thank you so much, both. I'm afraid that's sort of all we have time for on this panel, and I'll have to bring the proceedings of this discussion to a close. Suffice to say, thank you so much, Abhinandan, for joining us. Thank you so much, Chindu,
Before I sign off, I always tell the students whenever I do these sessions, in case you're wondering why would I spend 1.5 hours on a Sunday doing this, or when I went to Ahmedabad, why would I fly all the way to Ahmedabad and give a lecture to 50 kids and come back when I'm not compensated for it? What's in it for me? So I like to make it very clear why I do this. I do this because you guys are amongst the most privileged in our society. You may not think so right now, but you are. Trust me, the fact that you are where you are amongst the most privileged. And tomorrow you will be the higher earning. You will be the top 5%, 2%, 1% of the country. You will be sitting in boardrooms. You will be in a position to take decisions. What should your advertising money go with? What your board decides? Who you support on news? Should news be ad driven or not? So your students, you're not earning, but when you earn, make sure along with that, 800 rupee drink that you buy in the very famous Pune clubs, you also contribute to a news platform of your choice. But unless you do it, don't expect my generation to leave you a better country. Because unless you do it, this country that you inherit is going to be up shit creek. So it's up to you in how you shape it. And the reason I do this is that when you are in positions of power and your privilege has given you access to things that very few people in this country get, use it well, use it responsibly. Because earning money is very easy, I can tell you that. It's not rocket science.
Thank you. Well said. Clarion call for the students of the current crop of students of the Symbiosis University. Thank you so much, Abhinandan. Thank you so much, Chindu, for taking us through this conversation and working these out so well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sreedharan. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Abhinandan. We'll catch up soon.
Yes.
And it's been a great pleasure to be here as well, Vasudev. It was nice meeting you and everyone. Here is my little message, if I may, to you guys.
Please.
In a journalism is always, it's an opposing force. It's always going to be confrontational. It's always going to be a difficult job. My plea to all of you guys is some of you guys will actually become journalists. So become a journalist only if you mean to, if you can actually uphold the values of the profession, and if you really, really believe in it, and do meaningful journalism. Don't come here to make just noise. And that's what's actually harmed our journalism so much. So come to the profession. I would love to have more of you, but come to us, come to journalism, come into journalism, meaning to do good, meaning to change the society, meaning to uphold the democratic values, not to make money or not to get your face on TV.